All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our final installment in Preservation Connecticut's Summer 2025 series talking about preservation. I'm Stacy Vero. I'm a circuit rider at Preservation Connecticut, and I'll be serving as your host today, standing in for our Executive Director, Jane Montanaro. Today, we're going to be chatting with Dr. Leah Glazer. Thanks for joining us, Leah, of the public history. She's the professor of public history, a professor of history, right? Is that correct? And coordinator of the public history program at Central Connecticut State University. Today, Leah is going to be discussing her book, Branching Out: The Secret History of Trees. But before we get to that, we're going to give you a little bit of an introduction about our organization. As some of you probably already know, Preservation Connecticut is the statewide private nonprofit. We were founded in 1975. This is our 50th anniversary year, so please keep an eye out for a number of fun events that have already happened, which I hope some of you have attended and that will be happening in the future. And our goal when we were founded in 1975 as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation was to preserve, protect, and promote the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut's communities. We are statutory partners with the State Historic Preservation Office, and we're excited that this is our 50th year that we get to celebrate the championing of historic buildings, sites, and landscapes throughout the state. This is our office, the Eli Whitney Boarding House on Whitney Avenue, and we've had this headquarters since 1989. The folks who work there include 10 preservation professionals and a board of 21 preservationists from throughout the state. Some of our staff is listed here: Jane Montanaro, who is our executive director, Chris Wiegren, who's our deputy director, Renee Trebert, who is our preservation services manager, Jordan Sorensen, who is our development and special projects manager, Kristen Hopewood is our membership and outreach manager, Mike Farino is one of the circuit riders and is also the field services director. And our group of circuit riders currently includes Brad Scheid, who is our original circuit rider, me, Stacy Vero, who is sort of a general circuit rider, and Stefan Danchik, who is focuses on our grant programs and archaeology. And I also want to mention Andrea Florsheimer, who has been a wonderful contribution. She is a fellow who's worked with us, and she'll be leaving us shortly. So we want to acknowledge her publicly. So again, our mission has been to protect and promote buildings. And the goal of this program has been to really get you all talking. So today, if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat feature. You can wait and ask questions directly after or raise your hand. So we will moderate all of that. But thanks for joining. And in the fall, we'll be back to basics. We are going to be doing a series that will include a just sort of not hands-on workshops, but sort of basics, and we hope that you'll join us for those. So we also welcome your ideas. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leah. I'm going to stop sharing. And there you go.
Okay. Thank you, Stacy and Jordan and Preservation Connecticut for having me again. I think this is my third one of these, but I'm excited to talk about this topic. This was a book that I co-edited with Philip Levy, who's a professor of public history at the University of South Florida, Tampa. And it was a long time coming. We'd been talking about trees at various public history conferences for years, and decided during the pandemic that it was a good time to think about trees. And it just took a while to wrangle all these essays together. So what I'm going to do today is talk about what's in the book, talk about strategies of preservation, of preserving trees in very much the same ways that we think about preserving buildings. Because trees, our argument here is trees are a very unique resource in that they're not just natural, but they're very significant culturally as well. And we don't spend enough time thinking about that. Um, if we do think about that, we can understand that we can take a lot of the tactics and strategies we use to save the built environment and help preserve trees, which are one of the most important resources in an era of climate change, to preserve. So we are not the first people to consider trees as a hot topic in the last 10, 15 years. There's a growing interest in tree literature in the last 15 years or so. Probably a lot of you are familiar with the Overstory, but here's a lot of nonfiction. And so the environmental historians have really begun to explore both forests as well as urban trees. And this is our contribution as public historians. So for those of you who don't know, the kind of intersection between environmental history and public history has been going on for a while. And it's really interesting because the two movements actually came up together about the same time. The environmental movement coincides with the development of the public history profession in the 1970s or so. And at the same time, we have this word of sustainability that is the formal definition means fulfilling the needs of current generations without compromising the needs of future generations, while ensuring a balance between economic growth, environmental care, and social well-being. And at the same time, our word preservation means ensuring that resources of the past are there for present and future generations. So it's a very similar mission. And we don't often think about preservation and environmental advocacy together, but they're really interrelated in many ways. Our argument here is trees are place-based. Public history is interested not just in timelines, but in places, and trees offer context and strategies for discussing different issues in terms of environmental impact, which as well as social and cultural stories. So in 2002, a couple of environmental historians who are also public historians produced this book, Public History and the Environment. And then we went another decade or so without really talking about it. And then I edited this issue of the Public Historian in 2014, and that was the year we also made it the theme for Monterey and the National Council on Public History. And another colleague produced this public history in climate change that's still available, a series of essays. And in 2023, I published this book about interpreting energy. So there's a lot of movement in terms of people really trying to talk about the role of history and preservation with climate change. And I'm sure you're familiar with what museums and preservation have done in recent years in terms of Sarah Sutton's The Sustainable Museum. Obviously, Preservation Connecticut has talked a lot about how preservation can address issues of climate change, or how climate change is threatening historic properties, and also the whole idea of the sustainability of preservation. But the role of interpretation is really what we decided to focus on with this book, Branching Out the Public History of Trees. First of all, when in this crisis that we're in, we need all hands on deck. It's pretty obvious that scientists have been failing to communicate properly. I love this quote by Greta Thunberg, a teenage climate activist, no longer a teenager, but she says, "We cannot estimate the power of storytelling." And that's really within the within the wheelhouse of public historians and preservationists. So this book is a collection of essays of different tree stories that facilitate a connection to the natural environment through something other than science. So it came to this topic largely because there was starting, in like 2011 or so, we've had increasing storms that have made trees a big problem in Connecticut. They've brought down homes and cars, blocked roads. There was a winter snowstorm, but most of you are familiar with these kinds of scenes in and around the state. There's been, hold on, as trees have fallen, they have brought down utility lines, crashed through homes and cars, blocked roads, inaugurated aggressive policies to clear street trees. And local environmentalists have really lobbied for the importance of keeping as many trees and replanting as many trees because, of course, trees absorb carbon dioxide, clean the air, emit oxygen. They are our biggest kind of one of our most important soldiers in this war that we're in. But they also root local human histories in our places by physically and symbolically storing individual and collective memory. When these trees all went down, the response initially, and that's not, this one is a picture from my neighborhood, not even after a storm, the roots just eventually gave out from soaked soil. Our kind of hometown hero, Gifford Pinchot, has obviously a famous quote, while conflicting interests may be reconciled, the question shall always be answered from the standpoint of the greatest good of the greatest number in the long run. So there was a big response of the state, obviously, to start tree clearing as a policy that we're still that we're still dealing with. I'm sure you've noticed many of these work groups on the sides of the roads, public notices on trees to take them down because of the power lines, and making sure that all these trees are cut back from the power lines. And I'm sure you've noticed some of these on places like the Merritt Parkway where they've completely clear cut. And so that quote about figuring out what to do with conflicting interests, I would argue we really need to be careful about thinking that these things can't coexist, that our modern life and trees can't coexist because they kind of have to. And environmental groups like Hamden for Trees have been protesting this and argue that we just need to take care of the trees better. So how do we get more than just environmental activists to save these trees? I came to this because my first book was about electricity, and I happen to know that electricity and street tree planting came about at the same time. And so that's what my essay in the book really talks about. We know that trees are a little bit of a different resource than your typical colonial house. Sorry, these are overlapping. Trees are a living entity. They're a different kind of resource than a building. Trees die, but they also grow again. Whereas we know with buildings, as in this example in Derby, when they're gone, they're just gone and we can't get them back. So trees are a unique type of resource, which we can think of them as something that actually can be replaced in kind. Just not the exact tree, but certainly very close. And so there's different kinds of ways that we can take preservation terms and understand trees in a way that are both similar and different than buildings. And so I talk about in my essay that I go through different storms that brought down trees. And rather than clear cutting after the 1938 hurricane, there was a big call in all of the newspapers and editorials that I found, not for removing urban trees like today's response, but for prudent pruning and replanting, citing aesthetic, environmental, and health benefits, arguments that remain consistent with today's grassroots tree advocates. Power lines and the practice of forestry, again, evolved side by side as material benefits essential to early 20th century quality of life. Mature trees have all sorts of benefits. They absorb carbon dioxide, they release oxygen, they prevent heat islands, they contribute to flood control, and by clear cutting, we're exacerbating some of those issues. And trees have a lot of historical value as well. Again, trees root human histories to a place. They are central characters in the creation, in a lot of creation and origin stories. They help evolve with communities and define places, and they also serve as memorials. And so this book kind of touches on all of those things and more. We start by kind of explaining that trees, like other objects, can be seen as a part of material culture. They can act as artifacts through which to explore natural and cultural history. Thomas Sclereth, who's really known as a leading advocate of material culture, observed that tree plantings can mark historical migration, travel routes, document patterns of land ownership, mark settlements and property lines, influence housing types and local industry, not to mention explore ideas about recreation, aesthetics, public memory, and public health. And, we know that trees can tell stories through, scientific methods like dendrochronology. And for years, especially in the 30s, a bunch of different efforts to collect trees of note and to form the basis of today's notable tree databases called out insignificant trees, but they never talked about these other aspects and these different histories. They never talked about trees beyond them literally being of note and not contextualizing them. So I'm just going to go through the different ways that trees can be these cultural, tell these cultural stories. They are central characters in creation and origin stories, both native and also biblical. And also, of course, one of the most famed you see here is one of our origin stories of the country with George Washington and the cherry tree, things like the Garden of Eden. And this painting on the right is of a Native American creation story, the Yaqui Indians from the northwestern Mexico. But also here in Connecticut, you see a tree as a central item in the Mashantucket Pequot seal. And here you have what was considered Washington's cherry tree. And that's one of our essays by my co-editor, Phil Levy, who really talks about the story of the cherry tree and its renditions, where they, at George Washington's birthplace, they continue to interpret the cherry tree, even though it's obviously not the same tree. They keep planting this one, and it has this kind of long life and these different interpretations attached to it. One of the most common ways to think about trees as cultural is as living witness trees. Mature forests supplied native people of the eastern woodlands with tools, shelter, food, and they kept seasonally mobile between inland forest and the shoreline. Witness trees can locate and recall communal stories, such as treaty signings, meetings, or battles. And we see an example of the Mohegan Cedar Grove here. We also, as I mentioned, the Mashantucket symbol, which reflects the role of the tree and the wooded land and the woodland people. And at the same time, we have our own witness trees in non-native culture. Here is the Peaceable Oak in Bristol, which still stands. And then stories associated with famous people like John Brown's tree in Barkhamsted, which is still talked about on that site. According to the plaque of the Peaceable Oak erected in 1974, this was actually also a site where native people, likely the Tungus, reportedly met to borrow goods beneath this oak, and colonists likely used it for town meetings in the heat of the summer. It provided shade, and there are stories of the trunk also holding shot from the Revolutionary War. So this has a lot of affiliations as a witness tree. And then one of my students a couple years ago, Andy King, kind of found these stories about the role of the rhododendron in telling histories of the Mohegans as well, and that central place of that particular color rhododendron in those stories. And of course, the most famous one here in Connecticut, which is the Charter Oak as an origin story. Most of you know, of course, that the Charter Oak was used to hide the original Connecticut Charter when the King of England threatened to revoke it. And after it fell, finally in 1856 or so, there was a whole actual formal funeral for it, and different pieces of it were pilfered. And this is the most famous all kinds of things were made. Sam Colt had a cradle made for his baby. This is, of course, in the Senate chamber, and all kinds of these different material memorials were made from this tree. At the same time, um, saplings and scions were taken and planted all over the state. And we see that it's very much the symbol of Connecticut, as we saw on the quarter. So it's a big part of the origin story of even Connecticut here. But these legends and stories, I talked about the cherry tree and Washington's birthplace, are kind of throughout the country. And this book does deal with different stories around the country. Um, our book has a story about the Flushing Oaks in New York, which talk about the Quaker community, and their origin stories of that community. And then Andrew Hurley has a project, an oral history project in St. Louis, where he has used tree stories to uncover these different stories of the different neighborhoods of St. Louis, particularly African American neighborhoods, to talk about these different trees and people's relationship to their communities. And our book is divided into two parts, I should say. One is kind of about groups of trees and the role of trees in community, and the other one is about individual trees and interpretation. Um, Trees obviously serve as memory, as places of memory. They very much can be memorials on their own, but they can also serve as memorials after the fact. They can be planted as commemoration trees. Other examples of witness trees is the Granby's Dewey Oak, which kind of tells a story of can tell a story of the transition from private to public land. This picture of the Pinchot sycamore was already in one of the oldest trees in Connecticut, and considered a witness to the destruction of the town during the Pequot War. And in 1965, however, it was dedicated to Gifford Pinchot, known as the father of American forestry. And so it's both a witness tree and a commemorative tree and a tree of memory in a couple different ways there. Um, and sometimes trees can be parts of communities, and they can uh, be attached to people's memories very deeply. Just a few years ago, the Door tree was vandalized. This was this particularly odd-shaped two trees that kind of blended together as the Door tree. Kids had stories going back as part of their childhood. And in retribution to in a sibling rivalry a few years ago, in retribution to his brother, who he knew loved the Door tree, some guy went and took a chainsaw to the tree and destroyed it. So it was big news in Hamden. But here's another example of an essay in our book. This place known as Old Hickory on the Mississippi Delta that Brian Dempsey talks about as being very much a place of childhood memories and attachment for whole generations of people in Cleveland, Mississippi. Kind of more of these commemorative trees different from memorial trees in that they're planted from things like the Charter Oak or different kinds of elm trees planted at the 100-year anniversary of Connecticut. Those kinds of trees planted on Arbor Day or in out of respect and memory of veterans, such as World War II. So we see a lot of those. In preservation terms, a lot of these trees can be put into those preservation categories, whether it's criteria A in terms of telling these community stories, whether it's criteria C, this is of the National Register of Historic Places, of course. Criteria C, which usually talks about architecture. If trees are a part of a notable landscape, they can be under that. And and often memorials are not considered something that can be listed on the National Register, but they are listed as a possible criteria consideration F. And that's where actual memorials would go. And I would argue that trees can be pulled into that category of memorials as much as something that's made of granite could be. They are living memorials and monuments. They are objects of memory, not unlike the statues that we build. There's another centennial oak in Old Saybrook. One of the most interesting of the essays, and the one that we end the book with, was about the German oak, which was replanted in Los Angeles, and it has this really interesting international story. So, a Californian named Cornelius Johnson was one of a handful of African Americans who went to compete in the 1936 Olympics, which those of you who know your history know that that was during the rise of the Nazi regime. He won the gold medal. Um, and of course, the success of people like Jesse Owens and other African Americans showed that sort of disrupted this narrative of superiority that the Nazis had. But he wins the gold medal, and as part of the medal ceremony, a German high up in the administration had decided that they were going to give these oaks to all the gold medal winners at the 1936 Olympics. And they did this because the German oak, that what they called this particular oak, this particular species, which they referred to as the German oak, and we still refer to as the German oak, had become the symbol of Nazism in the new German Empire because it symbolized intense strength and rootedness, and it lasted. It had deep roots and could last a long time. It was a very strong tree, and so it became a symbol of the Nazi Empire and of Germans. And there were about 129 of them. And Cornelius Johnson, in any case, took this home to Los Angeles and he planted it in his backyard. And that's a picture of it today, but it's in pretty poor condition. And this German artist, Christian Meyer, who's now in Vienna, and the neighborhood have rallied around it to try to figure out how to preserve it and how to preserve this story. And he's created all this artwork from different saplings. It is one of 29 known of these German oaks that still exist that haven't died or disappeared in some way. And so there's a whole kinds of interesting ways to memorialize this story through these saplings and trees. My particular essay is focused on Connecticut and the role of trees in Connecticut. The role of trees not only as in forests, but also in our parks, and along our streets, even in our both in the rural areas, but also cities and across our roadways. The couple of our essays, including mine, talk about the role of landscape defining communities. This picture above, again, I mentioned that I kind of talk about these different storms and how we've responded to them, is a picture of the before and after of the Pine Grove and Sleeping Giant State Park. Sleeping Giant being the symbol of Hamden, Connecticut. I should have put a picture of the seal here, which is the home, of course, Preservation Connecticut. But in 2019 or 2018, a microburst tornado went through and completely took out this pine grove, which was such a contribution to Hamden's identity. And it really changed the way people thought about their landscape. There's a term called solastalgia, which speaks to this attachment that people have to their landscape and the trauma that ensues when it changes so drastically. And we saw that happening with the Hamden community. At the same time, you can really examine trees as part of larger cultural landscapes. This is a photo of the South Mountain, which is the Michoud National Forest in Pennsylvania. It's at the part of the Blue Ridge Mountains. This is an essay by Liz Sargent where she talks about this particular cultural landscape and all the different things that were natural and historical events. And I believe Liz is in the audience somewhere as well. So I wanted to thank her for for joining. It involves iron furnace work. It involves, tree management, all kinds of different layers of activity on these one sites you can examine through these landscapes and through trees. I talk a lot about urban landscapes and how they do define Connecticut. Homesick Mark Twain in California wrote about the trees of Connecticut. Some of these stately dwellings are almost buried from sight in parks and forests of these noble trees. Everywhere the eye turns, it is blessed with a vision of refreshing green. You do not know what beauty is if you have not been there. And so he really kind of noted how important trees were to the identity and Connecticut as a place. And Thomas Campanella, in his book Republic of Shade, said something similar in terms of the role of trees, almost as important as those of whitewashed steeples, all through New England, and really defining shade trees defining New England. We know that also, these trees, certain trees, are ubiquitous throughout communities, whether it's Elm Street, Maple Street, different kinds of place names that honor them. Our state forester, Austin Haas, talked, even he, who was very focused on the natural management of trees, even he admitted that splendid colonial houses nestled attractively among rows of great shade trees. These rows of maple and elm are monuments to the robust characters who planted them long ago. There's a picture of Austin Haas in the forest. And there he is on a camping trip with Gifford Pinchot, just in terms of the deep roots that forestry has in Connecticut, pun intended. So returning to that idea that you can take kind of these two opposing ideas of having modern power lines and trees and street trees along the same lines, I found a lot of evidence that there was several legislative acts and a lot of instruction in terms of how to plant street and highway trees in a way that they wouldn't interfere with power lines in Connecticut. And we can still look back on some of these manuals about roadside trees and see that one of the reasons that we have so many problems in recent years is that we've stopped managing trees. We've stopped maintaining trees. We've stopped understanding how to plant them and how to make them so that they are in cooperation with power lines and not in opposition. Finally, trees can represent not so positive stories and associations. Sometimes their presence or lack of presence can be instruments of discrimination and destruction. So on the right here, we see a May 2023 article that talks about trees being the cause of many highway deaths. This is, of course, evidence of historic resources on the lower right, sorry, of trees destroying historic homes. This one was as a result of that sleeping giant microburst. And this other image talks about the lack of trees as a result of kind of environmental injustice, as a result of segregation. Because in many neighborhoods where there had been redlining, there is a distinct lack of trees. And this particular image that I have shows that that can be a 10-degree difference in different neighborhoods to this day. The lack of trees in some of these neighborhoods where people were not permitted to own homes. And it has lasting impact today on people's public health and and issues of climate change and heat islands and things like that. So there's these associations between trees, race, housing, wealth, and health that illustrate the inextricable link between the cultural practices of tree planting and climate change. They can also be sites of violence, and a handful of the essays attest to this. Some of them focus on it exclusively. In Connecticut here, we have an example of what was a whipping tree in Litchfield, Connecticut, where people were punished. Obviously, it doesn't exist anymore, but it was there in the 1930s. As late as then as well, we had elm tree that had been used as the site of witch hangings in Hartford. And we have essays in the book that talk about these very things as well. This one in the upper left is Savannah, Georgia, and the one in the lower left is an essay about Sam Robinson's Sycamore. Sam Robinson was an African American interpreter who would tell stories at Jamestown, but not about the traditional Jamestown stories. He would tell this story about this particular sycamore on the Jamestown plantation, one that was uh, total of a different time period and a different perspective, African American perspective of this particular site. And so the essay kind of talks about issues of race and historical interpretation and what stories we tell. And here's another one that's in our afterword, featured in our afterword, about the Frogmore Plantation. Sorry for the typo there, in South Carolina, that you can still see the hooks put in there that would be used to chain people to the tree as punishment, presumably enslaved people. So those are just a lot of examples, and I wanted to also just kind of wrap up by talking about the role that preservation can play. In 2021, I wrote this blog at the National Council of Public History, which you can still go to, about guidelines for tree preservation. And I'm really proud of featuring this character from the Marvel movies. At the time, my kids were really into it. But this idea of this character known as Groot, who had in the first movie literally saved the world, being a kind of a sentient tree. And because of his powers, were able to save his friends and the world. And then after he dies, his friend replants him and he grows again and continues to be this superhero in subsequent movies. So this idea that if we preserve trees, if we understand how to manage them, if we think about them as part of our cultural world, we can have another tool in our toolbox. People have already started doing this. They've talked about, in terms of landscape preservation, replacing trees in kind rather than just ignoring them as part of either a historic site or cultural landscape. Replacement captures the function and spirit of restoration. It is a last but critical tool for tree preservation. And as well, there have been trees added to things like the National Register of Historic Places in recognition of their role in communities, as in this example in California. And lastly, there has been a movement not only for tree ordinances, but particular kinds of tree ordinances for heritage trees that people have started to review and incorporate, because they recognize these older trees as community assets as well as landmarks contributing to a sense of place. History does not always provide a solution, but can often help us, forgive me, see the forest through the trees in terms of these bigger pictures of place preservation. So these are just an example of some of the aspects that these tree ordinance provisions include. So nothing too different from traditional tree ordinances, but very much focused on the kinds of heritage trees and the kinds of trees that I've talked about. So that's all I have, but would love to field and answer any questions, anything more on any of the essays, or in general, any thoughts. I'd love to hear from the audience.
Thank you, Leah. We have a few questions that came in. If no one wants to jump in first, I'll give everyone a chance first. Wendy, I see your finger raised.
Hi, I'm Wendy Walker from Roxbury, Connecticut, and we have a project going where we're trying to replace trees on the green, both the ones that have been savaged by the the telephone companies and ones that have just not been treated well. And we're really searching for the best kind of trees. Do you have any research for that? So something that won't grow into the telephone wires, but will still present on the street level like a historic green.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely reference you to some of these older pamphlets that are in the state library.
Mhm.
I should try to, I have some digital copies that I kind of have to pull together and I guess somehow share publicly. But many of these shade tree guidelines from the 1920s, I think, could still be really helpful because they do talk about how large trees get and which ones are appropriate, particularly in town greens. But I wish I had a better answer in that. The funny thing about this book is, we were really interested in kind of these cultural aspects, and I'm not an arborist. But I was talking to an arborist just this past weekend, and they certainly could be, more than happy to kind of to address some of those issues. But I think going back and looking at some of those 1920s resources that were issued by the Connecticut Forest and Park Association um, in their records, they would have a lot of good ideas for you.
Mhm. The problem tends to be that some of the older trees have all had the blights and the bugs and so it's hard to know which to replace them with. That's
Yeah, and there's this interesting story is like when we had that consistency, right? When you put elms all through New Haven when there was when there was Dutch elm disease, it took everything out. And
Mhm.
that's the problem with planting all of the same tree. And so there is strategy now of alternating trees or having more of a mix so that when there is a pandemic, a tree pandemic, uh, that you don't have that kind of devastating outcome on your landscape.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Jack, is that the question you were putting in the chat there?
No, actually, I wanted to enhance your answer on that question about selecting trees. I'm in addition to dealing with historic property, I'm also chair of the tree commission in Hartford, and we are definitely dealing with a huge change in the context for urban forestry, uh, some of which relates to climate change and some is related to impending and recently acquired pests of one sort or another. So, uh, for instance, we don't sugar maples, which used to be a staple of Connecticut forests, really are not doing well under current circumstances. Um, and so we don't plant those anymore. Even though if you plant them, they'll be in good shape for quite a while, we expect them to suffer going along. There's a lot of, we actually have a list of suggested trees right now, which is probably quite different from what you'd see in some of those older pamphlets, because those were focused on currently successful native trees. Now we're having to look elsewhere to find trees that work because we can't plant ash trees, we can't plant beech trees, we can't plant most maples. It's really quite a challenge these days. So that's a little response on that question. My other question relates to your book. There's a chapter in there about the Canopy Story project in Portland, Oregon, which is my hometown. I'm wondering, I'm wondering whether that is still active. All I could find online was something from 2017.
Yeah, I think like many class projects, I think, it's probably still semi-active, but sometimes it's hard to keep these kinds of projects alive. I did try to do something during the pandemic very similar, and we ended up putting out a podcast on Grading the Nutmeg of some of those tree stories. So it's called Rooted in History if people want to still find that. Um, in reference to your previous comment about the different kinds of trees, it's be a really interesting preservation exercise, right? Just like we do with buildings, to think about which kinds of species of trees still have similar characteristics as the trees that were originally planted, in order that you can kind of recreate some kind of similar association and feeling, and those different characteristics. But I think it's a conversation between historians and arborists as well as the community. Let's see. Thank you Aaron for the article. I didn't see that article about the door tree stuff, but it's a good way of memorializing and turning trees into artifacts and stuff. Let's see, Don, great to hear about this book, thinking about your definitions. How do they relate to progressive era debate over 100 years ago between, they absolutely relate really closely, Don, in terms of, this idea of conservation. As a historian, I see very little difference between how people talked about conservation. I mean, there's differences, but what we call sustainability now was called conservation then. And it's the difference between management of resources and actually preserving resources untouched. And it's a different, obviously, attitude toward natural resources. And it is, when we talk about preserving natural resources, that's almost an impossible task, because natural resources like trees obviously continue to grow and change, and die. So in many ways, this idea of resource management, and sustainability really needs to be part of those preservation conversations as well.
So is there any place for John Muir's old idea of preserving the wilderness in its pristine state? Is there any place for that among Connecticut forests?
I mean, I think you can, the idea of preservation is that it doesn't change, right? And certainly that's the values that the National Historic Preservation Act was, going for, is kind of preserving these places in their most authentic state. But increasingly, just like trees, we are understanding that buildings have to change, or else they die, just like trees. So we have to maintain them. We have to maintain buildings. We have to maintain trees and natural resources. And I do think that we need to think of preservation differently than we've thought about it historically. Because not only do natural resources change, but the climate is making it challenging to preserve in that traditional John Muir sense, whether it's for natural resources or buildings. But we can think about what is important and why we want to save these places, and that's where those stories become really important, where we ask ourselves, why are we saving this, and what aspects of that natural or cultural environment do we want to last for future generations? Let's see, I'm glad here. Somebody asked about the chestnut tree. We do have, I think I accidentally deleted that slide. We do have a whole chapter on the chestnut by Carolyn Barsk. And she, I want to get the title of the essay correct. The Most Useful Tree, The American Chestnut Stories and Species Restoration. And it's about the American Chestnut Foundation and their efforts to save the chestnut and all of its different uses. So so there's a whole chapter on the chestnut, FYI. it's mainly, she's not really, just exclusively talking about Connecticut, but obviously relates to Connecticut, as Connecticut has that history as well. Okay, let's see. Oh, and I think Barbara Yeager's comment was maybe to the first question. And I'm just looking at Anstress Farwell's. I'm not sure this is, I just have to click it to see what that's connecting to. Yeah, this
It's
idea of the right, yeah, what trees to plant in places. Yeah. Yep. And kind of the modern version of those pamphlets, I guess.
Helen asked if you know of any literature on the cultural history of trees and the linguistic history of the people in communities. If there's a tie
Yeah.
there.
So let me jump in. Hi, Leah. Great talk. It was good to see you. Yeah. No, it occurs to me. I mean, like I think about trees all the time as a human being, right? But like I'm a linguist, as you know.
Yes.
And it occurs to me that the public history of trees, which I hadn't really considered, shame on me, must be necessarily connected to the linguistic history of trees, right? Like how trees are represented in the languages and in the communities, right? Because you talk about the cultural history, right?
Yes.
So how do you know any literature on this? I'm sure there must be something, and how, like, especially in light of your last answer, right? How preservation is no longer like this, set in stone, but must be something that shifts and evolves and kind of knows
And understands change.
understands change. Well,
Yeah.
this is what people talk about in terms of linguistic documentation as well, right? So this is more, when we talk about language revitalization, language documentation, we talk about reclamation, right? By the community, for the community, and linguists come in and assist, right? And I'm wondering if there is any literature on that, like as these two issues interact.
Yeah, and I'm
And
trying
if
to
not, let's do something.
Yeah. I mean, as you said, I'm sure there's a story there. I'm trying to think, and obviously I know how to get in touch with you, Helen. So I will let you know if I
I already sent you an email about that.
Okay. Yeah. Let me think on that and different ways that people might have approached that and understood how language reflects, right, how you think about certain ideas.
Sure.
So,
Sure.
Yeah. I would think there was something there on that.
Right. Okay, cool.
Let's see. I was just reading one. It's Russell. Looking to do an inventory of town greens and commons throughout Connecticut in partnership with Preservation Connecticut and DEEP. Oh, that's great. Yeah. That would be amazing. I mean, there's just so many opportunities and different projects to do. And the more we understand trees as part of that cultural landscape as well, the more buy-in and minds and accuracy.
Yeah, we're hoping to do an interactive map that's available either through DEEP or Preservation Connecticut that people can go to and explore the trees on all the town commons.
Yeah, and hopefully be linked to stories. I mean, that's the thing with Connecticut College's database. They have some of the stories in there, but it could be so much richer. When I had my students do their projects, I had them go to that database to identify trees, but then they came up with, stories that went well beyond just a little paragraph. So, just like the stories that buildings tell, there's a lot of understanding about community that we can pull out of just examining these groups of trees or individual trees, and can get people listening and to more connected to the trees, more connected to the place, and more willing to think of strategies that go beyond just clear cutting. And maybe invest in things like management and maintenance. Same things we think about with buildings. And I think Christina had a comment or question up here.
It relates to what you were just talking about, how to
Okay.
get municipalities to see the benefit of trees and treat them with, you know, a level of
Yeah.
respect.
Yeah. You know, as Christina knows, you know, she's a great storyteller. I think the more it seems like everybody has a tree story, and that's kind of part of the book too. People really like the Old Hickory essay because it's about childhood and the forest and the attachment that we have for people who grew up with trees, whether it's the giving tree or anything like that. You know, that kind of visceral emotional attachment helps you care, makes you care about certain trees. But if we are able to kind of expand that, I think there's an argument for saying that we can get more investment out of people if they are able to approach it and relate to trees at that personal, kind of visceral, emotional level, and not just see it as, you know, a part of the natural environment and something that environmentalists are screaming about.
Does anyone else have another question or comment? As Jordan noted, there's going to be a list of the chat that she'll send out to everyone because it contains so many wonderful resources.
Yeah,
so
it sure does. Yeah.
that'll go out, and contact us with any questions too. We can get in touch with Leah too.
Yeah, and
So-
I'm so glad that people are here from again, the more we talk to each other and get out of the silos, the more the environment and the historians, the scientists and the humanities get together, the more we can really address important, overwhelming issues, I think. And thank you, everyone, for your great questions and your great contributions.
Thank you, everyone. We will see you in the fall, hopefully. Leah, thank you so much.
And you'll have when you send out the chat, can you send a link for the book, please, too?
Of course. Of course.
All right.
Definitely do that. Definitely do that. Definitely.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.